It's the Lean Podcast.
Hi, my name's Ciara.
Hi, I'm Romy.
And this is
The Lean.
Welcome to the first installment in our brand new mini-series all about remote interpreting.
How exciting!
So exciting. Romy, tell us about today's topic.
Well, today's topic is remote interpreting, all about adapting. And basically when Ciara and I came up with this idea, we were thinking, okay, the world's got a bit mad and we are all remote interpreting and it's been a massive change, but it's also been adapting. We've all been shifting and changing to match the current climate, to work online. So one of the first things we wanted to look at was how we've adapted and in what ways. I mean, it's so broad.
There's so much to cover. There's so much involved in remote interpreting. And I think a good place to start is how you set yourself up to remote interpret. Now, Romy, I don't know about you, but I've learned a lot of things in these past few months. And what I did at the very start of those months is very different to what I do now.
Totally.
In regards how I've adapted, if you like. My actual setup has been on quite a journey, you could say. It began on an ironing board. It's now on a desk. So
wow, you've really moved up in the world.
I've really, progressed, you could say. But I've learned a lot. And adapting was no easy feat. I'll tell you that for free.
Yeah.
But it's been a journey. I've learned many things.
We've been doing nothing but adapting. And I mean, on so many levels, not only just in creating or interpreting spaces. I mean, I've had at least 5 moving around the house, trying to find the right place. And then I relocated home to be with my family and got a really nice space going, but it was still change. But on top of that, it's like adapting how you work online. I mean, You now have if you're working in a team, someone who is not on site with you and how you adapt to communicate with them to support each other. I've done it like 6 or 7 different ways.
Yeah, and I think it depends a little bit like we talked about before. We talked about team interpreting. It very much depends on who you're working with and the situation you're in. So what might work super well with one team interpreter in one particular assignment could be completely different working with someone else on something different. So again, you have to adapt within your new space of remote interpreting. And how do you do that when you're not physically with someone right beside you and we do such a people-centric job? How do you adapt is the question.
The thing is, I feel like I'm still adapting. Like even now being remote for over 10 weeks, still feel like I'm changing every job, still tweaking and making it better. And I don't know if that'll ever not be the case.
I know.
But I mean, we do it in the real world as well. On site, we do these adaptations, but I don't think they're as big or they don't feel as big because you're on site and it's part of the job. I think they're just magnified by what's going on at the moment.
Yeah. But I think it's very important to remember that everyone is adapting. That's really helped me. It's not just like, oh, I can't do it, I'm not very good at this, and this. I think it's very much everybody, even if you're just fresh out of training or if you've got years and years and years of experience, it's all so new.
Yeah.
I think that's been the lovely thing that I've had. I've had some great conversations with some interpreters, and what's really nice to know is that, and reassuring, is that everybody is kind of in the same boat. And kind of the issues I'm having are very similar to someone who may have way more experience than me. And to see that someone that talented and experienced is having the same issues I'm having is very kind of heartwarming in a way.
Totally.
Because it makes me think, no, Ciara, it's okay. If we just work together, we're going to get through it together. And that's been one of the most important things I've found anyway.
Yeah.
With adapting is making sure that everybody is aware of you're not trying to mask anything. Everybody's aware of the issues we're all facing from working at home, relying on technology, which is not always very reliable, especially when you're in the middle of all sorts of situations and your Wi-Fi decides to not cooperate.
Yeah.
Using different platforms, figuring out how to use platforms, wishing that platforms had other functions that they just don't have.
They just don't have. And then also I feel it depends on the chair or whoever is managing the meeting as well, and how many deaf clients you have in the audience, and whether you need to voice them over, as in work into English, and you have like 7 of them on screen and you have to manage it. It's very quick adaptation. And I think the other thing as well that I have in my notes is like backup. So like, it's again, it links to adaptation. If one thing doesn't work, have another thing. So like, okay, my Wi-Fi goes down. Okay, well, I'll try plug it in with like the USB port. If that doesn't work, okay, we'll use my phone as a hotspot. Like having your backups. Similarly, okay, your computer suddenly decides it doesn't want to work anymore. Okay, onto my phone I go. And it's, like you say, health and safety is so important, but sometimes it's less ideal, but you still need to make things work somehow.
Exactly.
Backup. Yeah, there's been a lot of adaptations in my life. I was in my bedroom, like kind of sort of kneeling and interpreting, and I had my it was very uncomfortable for health and safety.
That sounds awful.
Oh, it was bad. It was that, or it was like stand in front of the bathroom, which was like the only space in the house that was big enough to work from, but it meant my housemate had to like walk around me if he needed the bathroom. So that's why
that sounds very challenging.
Well, so like Dublin isn't the best place for big houses, even if you are working. So it's very tough to adapt in quite a small living space. I live with my best friend ever, so it was fine. But even then, when I came back home and I actually now have my own office space in my house, made the world a difference.
Well, I've told you about I suppose I can take you through my journey of my desks. So
I quite like your ironing board. I mean, I feel you should have stuck with it.
My desk began as an ironing board. And look, what I'll say is this. Don't underestimate an ironing board. They can come in very handy. You can change the heights. You know, you can set that low and sit down. You can put it up higher, have a standing desk. So I began with an ironing board. Then we discovered we had a desk that was dismantled in our house. So I had to assemble the desk with no instructions, just a screwdriver that I think was about 40 or 50 years old. Look, I mean, it was pretty ropey. Because I forgot to put in quite an important screw, and it was very wobbly, I'd say, for a good 2 weeks until we discovered that problem. But now it's great. I now have a desk chair, I've got an extra screen. Things have really, it's been a journey that I've went on with my remote setup, but what I'll say is we've got there.
But this second screen business, I feel like, is essential. I don't have one yet.
Yeah, what I'll say is second screens for me were a game changer when you're interpreting on Zoom and if they're sharing a screen. So if someone shares a screen, then everybody goes tiny. And you can like stretch it as much as you can, but they're still very small. Whereas when you have the second screen, you can have the PowerPoint on one side and then you can have people on the gallery on the other side. So you still have you got a little bit more to work with. So that was very helpful, I have to say. That helped an awful lot. That's been my evolution.
Just adapting left, right and centre, really.
I was going to talk about angles.
Oh.
Romy, get those angles.
This is just as good for selfies as it is for like sign language interpreting remotely.
They're very important. And what I've found the best way to get a great angle... Ciara's hot legs. For my laptop is to sit on 4 recipe books. I particularly like a cookbook because they're large and in charge. They're nice and stable and they've got good height. So I've got a 4 recipe book. Sometimes I go with 3 recipe book height. But I find that keeps my laptop up stable. Use what you have.
I also have books. Mine, however, are like, so I come from a family of architects, and mine are like the history of the topography and the antiquity of Limerick City, volumes 1 through 5. Then we've also got Limerick History and Society, Civil Survey of County Limerick, 1654 to 1670, whatever. Yeah, these are the tomes that rest under...
Little did they know that they would be supporting international remote interpreting.
They're finally being put to use. That was gas.
Well, I think all I really have to say about adapting. It's been a journey.
It has. And it's still going. I don't think the adaptations are as drastic. I think they're much more fine-tuned now, but yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Some, I could say, have been more successful than others.
Absolutely.
But I think it's very interesting to hear everybody's own experiences and how they've been dealing with it. 'Cause it's the only way to learn.
It is. So I guess we should probably maybe a little bit introduce who our guest is.
Oh, on that note. So today we are joined by a wonderful guest. Robyn Dean has joined us to talk all about adapting in remote interpreting.
Robyn Dean is a nationally certified ASL interpreter with over 25 years, particularly in healthcare. She has over 20 publications, one of which Ciara and I are obsessed with, which is the demand control schema that she wrote with Robert Pollard. She is currently an assistant professor at Rochester Institute of Technology and is the lead instructor for the Institute's postgraduate degree in healthcare interpreting.
I'm so excited to talk to her. Great. Without further ado, welcome to the podcast. Right, well, welcome Robyn Dean to the Lean. We are so happy to have you here.
Thank you, I'm thrilled. I just put on Facebook that I was going to be on a podcast, and I thought that must happen because I've listened to over 5,000 hours of my own, podcast that I'm interested in. And then I think that that's like the bonus. Once you pass 5,000 hours of listening to podcasts, you get your own. So let's get started.
Let's do it.
Okay, well, Robyn, would you like to tell the viewers and listeners of the Lean podcast a little bit about yourself and your interpreting background?
Sure. So you can read biographies and they give you sort of the highlights, but what they don't tell you is a couple of these things that I'll bring up. So I actually started learning American Sign Language at the age of 11. In the theater. I don't have anybody in my family who is deaf, but I was involved in children's theater, and there was a deaf theater that kind of tried to work or merge with us. And so actually the first person I met who was a sign language user was an interpreter. And I think I'm one of the earliest generations where interpreters pass along sign language to other interpreters as opposed to deaf people. I think that's sort of another avenue that you can come in. Now, granted, soon after that, I got involved with the deaf community quite quickly after that and sort of learning American Sign Language directly. And that was through really the only place that deaf people, at this point I was living in Florida at the young age of 11, 12, 13. The only way to get access to deaf people in Florida is through religious organizations. So I would sit in a Southern Baptist church, not being remotely Southern Baptist, and just using the opportunity to chat, if you will, and learn from the deaf community as much as I possibly could. And then I went to an interpreting program in Maryville, Tennessee, which is in the southern eastern part of the United States. It is the first, though there's some argument with another university. It was the first 4-year bachelor level degree program in the United States. So this is back in 1986, of which there were only 2 at the time. So I went to that program, graduated, became certified soon after, went to become mostly a freelance interpreter. Worked in medical and mental health settings almost immediately, but interestingly enough with deaf professionals. So now in the U.S., it's common to refer to interpreters who work with deaf professionals in a regular way as designated interpreters, and I understand the term sometimes gets used elsewhere as well. But designated interpreters, we didn't have that term. So I was just mostly working with deaf professionals for the majority of the first 10 years of my career, which is really the outgrowth, or I should say the sort of stimulus for what eventually became my academic work, for a couple of reasons, and I'll talk about those later. And then in 2001, I started getting funded by the U.S. government, Department of Education, to produce and create materials based on Bob Pollard's and my theoretical material. And academically was supported, excuse me, not academically, but from a grants perspective was supported in my career for about a decade. And then I was offered a PhD scholarship to Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh. Graham Turner, Jemina Napier, Svenja Verm, this great group of people, and went there for 3 years and got my PhD. And now I am teaching full-time in a graduate program at the Rochester Institute of Technology, National Technical Institute for the Deaf. Their new graduate program in healthcare interpreting, and I'm one of the main instructors on that program. So that's me in a nutshell.
So interesting.
Oh, Robyn, you're so cool. I can't handle it. As you know, our mini-series is all about remote interpreting, and this particular episode is all about adapting. You've heard a little bit about what me and Romy have gone through to try and adapt the journey from the ironing board to the desk. Romy's library that she sets her laptop up on.
Yep.
But Robyn, we really want to know, what do you think adapting in remote interpreting is? Big question.
Yeah. Well, I think you are aware that my colleague Amanda Smith and I wanted to address what we were seeing with our colleagues, both in the UK and in the US, around, all of a sudden I'm a remote video interpreter. And, Amanda Smith and I, through our work with Iris, which I'm trying to avoid saying lengthy names because someone's going to have to interpret this, but maybe you could put it at the bottom of the screen. So this is the Interpreting Institute for Reflection in Action and Supervision. So the idea that we're trying to advance reflective practice and supervision within the interpreting field. And while we tend to take interpreting practice and reflection more broadly, sometimes you can't really attend to people's broad needs when they're not getting their practical needs met. And so we decided to host a webinar and really sort of stand in the background as the host, because neither one of us are supporting ourselves in any significant way having to do remote interpreting, and hopefully give sort of the spotlight to the other panelists who were all willing to donate their time and just make that available to people. I think that adapting is a choice. I think there's a lot of emotional reaction that comes to adapting, and I think that interpreters should be more aware of the emotional reactions that come along to being thrown into what Paul Ricoeur, R-I-C-O-E-U-R, French philosopher, called disorientation as part of his orientation, disorientation, reorientation philosophy or scheme. And so when you're thrown into disorientation with anything, such as being a human on the planet and having to deal with an international pandemic, to now being an interpreter in a way in which you've never perhaps done that kind of interpreting, seeing people two-dimensionally, etc., and having to attend to the family and such within the next perhaps space next to you. So I think that this has been a very disorienting experience for interpreters, not to mention, obviously, everybody else on the other side of that screen.
Sure.
And making sure that we attend to both our own emotional reactions and psychological reactions, but also we have to somehow attend to the emotional and psychological reactions happening for the people on the other side as well. And I think that when you're so frustrated, tired, angry, it's hard to have patience and kindness for people on the other end, right? So that's referred to as emotional labor. The amount of work that we as interpreters have to do in our normal face-to-face work as emotional labor is very intense, obviously, and then this emotional labor is a little bit different, right? You're mostly dealing with your own emotional reactions, the emotional and psychological reactions of others, and everybody trying to maintain some sense of decorum at the same time, and productivity as well. And trying to further the values of important things such as like access to communication and access to information.
And I think it's something that is forgotten. Like even when Ciara and I were chatting about adaptive, we were talking about real world mechanisms rather than the internal change that is also happening in response to what's going on. So it's a very important thing to bear in mind.
And I think that when we don't bear something in mind, it finds its way out in other ways that we are not prepared for, not ready for, and oftentimes can have some pretty bad ramifications, right?
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear you talk about disorientation, because I actually work as a VRS interpreter half the time, so half of my work was already that, but then when everything got turned remotely, and I kind of thought to myself, no, Ciara, you're okay, because you've got a bit of a background working remotely. You're gonna be okay. No, that was not okay, because all those things that you're normally so used to and they're so smooth and easy when you're face to face are suddenly completely different. And like what you're talking about, how your body kind of nearly fights to protect your soul, the tiredness and the fatigue is something else. It really is, and you can really feel it. And although I was very used to a system and I was kind of had adapted to that my own kind of way from when I'd been working with that, but then when it turned to everything else, everything that would normally be out in the world was now suddenly in my sitting room, that you could really feel the strain, I have to say. I really felt it.
It makes me think of my decision to move to Edinburgh when I was 43, thinking, what am I doing? I mean, I have a house of 15 years, I have a career, yada, yada. And I thought, but, it's not going to be that hard to adapt to the UK because, culturally and linguistically. And then, of course, just like you, thinking, oh, VRS, VRI, how difficult can it be? So America, Scotland, and then... So that makes me wonder if interpreters, when faced with this, I thought it was going to be one way, and perhaps not as bad as it is, and the decision fatigue of constantly having to say, all right, I should probably do something at this point, it becomes so intense that you end up, the decisions become do nothing, not because do nothing is a good decision, but because you just can't make another decision.
So with that decision fatigue is to be aware of it, one, so that you can take the action to look after yourself and recoup, because we're a profession that's particularly susceptible to burnout. And with everything that's going on, you don't realize until it's too late. So it's critical to put a name on things so that people can be more reflective of what's going on internally.
We oftentimes don't take proactive action, right? That's a bit of a redundancy, right? But we're not proactive, right? We tend to wait until there's a problem and then we do something, and that's sort of human nature, right? And that's one of the reasons why supervision and reflective practice is so important, because it basically says, I know you don't particularly feel like you need to talk about this, situation or your work or whatever, but trust us in the process, because and we talk about the famous last words of somebody saying, well, I've got the situation that there's really not much to talk about, it'll take like 5 minutes, but okay, and about an hour and a half later I'm going, okay, we really do need to wrap up this conversation. So, a 5-minute story in your mind, right? Because that's what your mind also does. Your mind minimizes things. And so you can't really on some level trust your brain to actually apprehend what the experience was, which I think is why it's good to have rituals and mechanisms in place that you just sort of aren't necessarily going, well, I'll exercise what I feel like exercising. Now, please don't think that therefore I'm a person who's out there with some sort of exercise discipline and regimen, because I'm not. But I do truly believe in it philosophically. But I certainly am advancing it in the field of don't wait until the emotional toll, psychological toll that interpreting work, like any practice profession, can have on you emerges in negative ways.
I mean, it's why EIPI is so important, because it does build up that self-reflective system, right?
Right. On some level, any sort of theory making, right, naming things, whether it's the context like EIPI or whether it's this idea of consequences and decision making that DCS tries to advance, these theories, while artificial on some level because they're trying to grasp reality, which of course reality will always, or the phenomenon of life will, be ungraspable on some level, they do help our brains work through them in ways that reduce the cognitive load. Right? Mm-hmm. And so if we can reduce the cognitive load of our brain trying to pick up on all these things because we have categories that go, oh, that's that, then you're more likely to move through your decision making in easier ways. Cognitive rehearsal does the same thing, right? If I say to myself, so on some level, Ciara, you sort of set yourself up for failure to say, oh, how hard can it be? Mm-hmm. Because the brain is looking for those kinds of things, right? That's what the brain does. It's very efficient, and it wants to make sure that it doesn't have to expend any more energy than it has to for good, biological reasons. One of the things that I think we like about it, well, let me speak for myself. What I like about interpreting, or is the excitement of it all, is sort of the challenge of performance in the moment. Yes. And it kind of takes away the fun or the mystery when you go, okay, so let's think about what's about to, let's do some prep work. It's like, man, let's show up and
keep the magic alive.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, well, that kind of leads us on nicely to our next question.
Yes.
Is there any specific example or experience or something that sticks in your mind that truly represents adapting when it comes to remote interpreting for you?
I think it, and again, even though you're saying in remote interpreting, I tend to think of things a little bit more broadly and saying, this is not unique, right? On some level, yes, that when you get down to the bits and pieces, it definitely is unique, right? Mm-hmm. But when you back away from a topic, you say, right, I can see how this is similar to this, this, and this. And I think actually reminding yourself of that is helpful, because you can say, this is actually similar in these ways. I've been in situations where I've been disoriented, and I came through it, or I remembered that when I did come through it effectively, I did these things, right? So I tend to like theories, like frameworks, like processes, because they allow you to see, as the book of Ecclesiastes says, there's nothing new under the sun, right? Basically, we're all experiencing the same. It's like Groundhog Day, right? I know people are using that as a term to talk about living under a pandemic, but I think on some level, the human experience is the human experience. My master's degree is in theology, in part because I thought the 5,000-year-old story is still relevant today. On some level, you change the names and the characters, and yet the struggle for justice, for example, is still ongoing, which is obviously what the Hebrew text and Christian text is all about. Is about justice, arguably, and so pardon me if I'm going too esoteric when I say this, but I think that when I think of an example of adapting, I think about, I graduated from my 4-year program. I thought, I know how to do this work, right? I was pretty competent linguistically, in part because I started learning at a young age, learned from the deaf community, or at least a portion of them, and had my ethics, right? Passed my test, did all those things. And then I went out into the practice world, and I'm like, oh. And you could argue that no profession,
Sure.
can adequately, fully give you an understanding of the work. But I was particularly concerned because, as I mentioned at the introduction, I worked amongst other professions, right? And I worked with these deaf professionals amongst other hearing professionals in educational environments, practice educational environments, so internships and practicums and that kind of thing. And so I was constantly being exposed to the ways in which other practice professionals prepare their new practitioners. And I kept saying, we've got none of this, right? And so it could have been the case that I could have said, because I would sit down with my colleagues, right, and we over coffee, and we'd be sort of, moan to each other about, oh my gosh, and this and that, and I was quite happy with moaning on some level, right? A cup of coffee and moan, and then you go back to work, and the change really came for me because really all I did was go to Bob Pollard and moan, because he was the head of the program that had these deaf professionals. And so I kind of felt like he was my confessioner, right? Like I could go to him and say, hey, look, so I made this decision and it probably isn't right from the, ethical perspective, but it seemed to work really well. And I would, and he'd be like, well, that's interesting because, that would be perfectly acceptable and blah, blah, blah. And he wasn't moaning along with me. He was like saying, well, that's interesting, and perhaps you should do a literature search. And I'm like, oh man, this guy is, annoying. And at one point he said, well, why don't you, start doing some research to find out who's talked about this already. So I put in some words, begrudgingly, keywords, a Boolean something or other. Anyway, so he was like, okay, so you're set to do your literature review, and he walked out. And literally, I put in stress and a couple of other keywords, and the first thing on my little list was Demand Control Theory by Robert Karasik, Healthy Work. And I'm like, good, done, check, found it. So I, at some point got the book out of the library and read it. And of course, that's really when everything changed. So my point here is that adapting, I think, has phases and stages, and I think the initial phase is to moan and be quite content with the moaning, even to find solidarity and connection, which is usually invigorating. So we get sort of that emotional need met, and we think, okay, we're done. But then the next gig is going to be equally as frustrating, and we're not necessarily going to have any sort of recourse or new skills in place as a result of that. And so we're just going to basically end up so at some point it's going to have to become, in this case, I had somebody who wouldn't moan along with me, even though he didn't realize it was fun, apparently, and said you should look into research. And so the idea of looking outside yourself, right? So when moaning ends up being, ineffectual or not enough fun or sickness creating, then it's time to move into perhaps there's something else outside of this bubble that I'm in that might have something to say about this topic.
That's true, because I sometimes think of an interpreter as a bit like a comedian, because we find ourselves in so many different situations, and you have to kind of morph into or blend in wherever you are, and to make sure that, communication is smooth and everything happens. So I suppose if you think about it that way, if you just think of things switching to online as just another kind of aspect of adapting in your own kind of little comedian way, which you're doing all the time anyway as an interpreter, And
yes. And I think that was one of the powerful things when I read Karasik's book, was the word demand of the job. Just to sort of think of something as a demand. It's not out to get you, right? It's not personal, right? It's just what the job is asking you to do. And I know that sort of sounds like a cognitive trick or something that is supposed to bring about, a Buddhist level of Zen. But it really is, if you do focus on some of these ideas about, this isn't personal. Everybody's doing the best that they can with the resources that they have. If you understand people's behavior in the context that they're experiencing and they're reacting from, it makes much more sense than it does to you on the outside. So the ways in which you can kind of remind yourselves of these realities that and you often give yourself the pass off, right, when those things happen to you, the idea that we would then extend them to people, right, outside of us, is an important reminder, I think. Which is connected to what I was going to say in response to the final question about the tip, right? Self-care, while certainly I believe in baths and yoga and hot tea and hot toddies and all those things that are sort of soothing, I think that there's another self-care tactic that is a little bit more long term in its effectiveness, and that is thinking about the way that you think, right? Taking a look at your thoughts. And taking a look, and usually we find our thoughts from our emotions, right? The emotion is the first thing we feel, right? And so once we're done sort of raging or whatever about whatever emotion we're feeling, and then we say, okay, so what thought is creating, right? Typical cognitive behavioral therapy approach, right? What thought is creating that emotion? Because if you really want to address the emotion, stifling it actually doesn't work as effectively. As a matter of fact, that's what emotional labor research has shown, is that repression of saying, I feel these things, but I'm not supposed to feel these things, or at least I'm not supposed to display them, and so I'll just suck it up, right? Actually leads to the things that we talked about earlier, burnout, compassion fatigue, etc. When you have an emotional reaction to something somebody does or says, you try to remind yourself that most people behave in reasonable ways, and there's likely a reason why their behavior or what they've said comes from a certain place. That doesn't mean that obviously we stand for abuse, or, I'm not certainly talking about that, but let's talk about sort of under the bell curve of normal human engagement. Is that you say, I wonder what that person is responding to. And to give that, again, as I've already said, extend that kindness and that cognitive benefit of the doubt to other people. And on some level, it doesn't matter if it's true or not, because the point here is that you're really doing it on some level for yourself and the next person that you come into contact with. Right. Because if you come into contact already charged with somebody else that doesn't deserve, if you will, the same kind of charged nature that you're walking in with, I think is something for us to be, again, concerned about for ourselves and those individuals we engage.
Romy, it goes to my political slogan, kindness costs nothing, but
Yes.
It's so true, it's so true.
This has been phenomenal. Thank you so much for
It's been
agreeing to do
amazing.
this.
Thank you.
Oh, it's
so
fun.
much.
Thank you so much
Made
for
our
inviting
podcast
me.
dream come true.
Oh, that's very kind of you to say. That's very
Absolutely.
good.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Lean Podcast, the mini-series.